Well, good morning. I'm Todd Voss. I'm the president at Wesleyan University, and I'm just so delighted to have all of you here. It turns out that Carl and Ann Sheriff started to talk a little bit about what to do with this cemetery and to think about how is it going to be cared for into perpetuity, right, Carl? And so Carl came to see me, and he said something like, I got a cemetery, and I'd like to give it to Swoop. And I said, yes! I believe, and of course I'm not very popular with other college presidents, I've got to tell you that right now from what I'm going to say. But I believe higher education is broken. I believe the way we do business in higher education is broken. And I believe there is a path that can get us out of that, and that path is called inventive learning. It's called hands-on learning. It's called getting your hands dirty and allowing our students to learn things in a whole new way. Not just to read, regurgitate, get a degree, and say, now what am I going to do with my life? But it's to say, I really understand that because I did that. I touched that. I impacted that. So when we start thinking about inventive learning related to history and journalism, related to writing, we have to think a new way. And this is a new way.
Well, good morning. I've been looking forward to this day for, well, I can't say my whole life, but pretty close. What a day this is, and I'm just so happy to see all of you all here this morning. Thank you to Southern Wesleyan, but really thank you to all of you. There are a lot of people here that I've seen here before that have helped work in this cemetery for years. I can prove that I've been here for at least 55 years working in this cemetery. Dad and I started in 1960. You could see most of these graves here, but you couldn't see those. You couldn't see, and you certainly couldn't see back in there. It's called kudzu. And honeysuckle and bramblebriars and everything else. And 7 years on Saturday afternoons and some holidays, etc., Dad and I were here. And I loved it. I had my dad all to myself. Who wouldn't love that? And so eventually it's as you see it now, and it hasn't changed much in those years since then. But it does take constant maintenance, and Southern Wesleyan didn't balk at that. Dr. Myers has already told me, he said, there's at least, he said, without even thinking, I can give you 25 topics for master's degrees and PhD theses right here, out of this acre. And he said, that's without thinking. He said, if I think, we can get hundreds. So we may actually learn something out of this, or maybe future generations will.
I'm Ken Dell, I'm the University Chaplain, Associate Vice President for Spiritual Life, and it's an honor to be here today and to be with you for this time. Cemeteries are sacred ground. They are bridges of names, bridges of dates, bridges of memories that connect the living with the past, that connect those that are alive with those that were once alive. So today, we respectfully receive Pickens Cemetery. And in the spirit of contagious generosity and inventive learning, we join our faith-filled community with yours. And we dedicate again this cemetery to the preservation of these sacred stories, to the educational enrichment of our students.
I'm Ken Myers. I'm professor of history here at Southern Wesleyan University, chair of the Humanities Division, and I'm so proud and so glad to be here. Now, some might be tempted to think, what's the big deal? It's a cemetery. No disrespect is meant, but there are lots of cemeteries. What's special about this one, and why is it a big deal that it's been donated to our university? Well, I can tell you why this is a big deal and why we're celebrating today. There are a number of reasons why this gift is important to Southern Wesleyan and its students. Number one, The Pickens Cemetery is unique. It's true there are lots of cemeteries, but not many of them have the characteristics that this one has. First, it has people buried here who go back to colonial times. Some of them were born in England or Ireland. Some of their birth dates are back in the 17th century, the 1600s. So it goes way back. Second, it has a number of Revolutionary War veterans interred here, one of which is Captain Robert Pickens, who was the first cousin to General Andrew Pickens, who you may have heard of, who was one of the leading generals in the southern part of the Revolutionary War. Third, the cemetery has both slaves and slave owners buried here, as well as veterans of the Civil War and every other major conflict that the United States was involved in. And because we have a lot of supporting documentation and resources, thanks to the work of Mr. Garrison, we already know quite a bit about these people, which will make it easier to write their stories. So the Pickens Cemetery is indeed unique. Second, this is an opportunity, as Dr. Voss and others have said, for hands-on history. In most history programs and with most history projects, students read about history and perhaps do some research with primary and secondary documents. And that's okay. There's value in that. But the Pickens Cemetery will allow our students to connect a physical reality that they can see and touch with the research and writing that they will do. The Pickens Cemetery will enable our students to make a direct connection with the people here as well as with the community that they built. Third, this is an opportunity to write the story of an entire community and make it come alive. For most of the history of our country, a community revolved around its churches. People worshiped there, they socialized there, and sometimes their schools even met there. Babies were christened or dedicated there. People were baptized there. Couples got married there. And those who passed on were buried in the church cemetery. And the cemetery formed a physical record of the people who had lived in the community and who had helped to make it what it was. Not to be disrespectful, but a cemetery is much like a fundamental database for the community. It is the backbone of the record of that community. With supporting documentation, you can literally recreate the story of that community and make it come alive again. Fourth, the research done here will enable students to make a personal connection with history. Studying history as an academic and intellectual activity certainly has value in its own right. History is an important academic field. But sometimes history can teach you something about your own life. The gift of this cemetery will be a tremendous asset and a tremendous blessing to Southern Wesleyan University, to its surrounding community, and most importantly, to our students.
I feel kind of bad because I think I almost invited myself to participate here today because I saw Dr. McCorder and she told me what was up, and I said I love that place. I absolutely love that place. This is not my first time here. It's not my second time here. As a history major, I just eat this stuff up. But the preservation of history and celebrating the history of all of us is important, because a lot of history is only half the history. And if you're not writing the whole thing, you don't know what went on. And this is to be celebrated. And for a university to have the vision to do this and to have applied history where you can touch it and you can feel it and you can research those people back, it's just an absolute true gift. And I think we owe a great debt to the Garrison family for preserving this. Anderson County wants to participate in this project with you, not lip service. Mr. Waters said, like real money, things you can spend. But it is an honor and a privilege and a pleasure.
I've been a part of the community for quite a while. Mr. Garrison, I know your little brother Tommy Keaton, because he's done a very good job of keeping this up. And knowing the family, the way I learned history was by listening to Tommy talk about what your father talked to him about. And the history that's here, Tommy would listen to stories from Mr. Garrison, and then Tommy and I would get together, and then I would listen to the stories coming from him. And a lot of times, the history books cover a lot of stuff, but there's so much more, just as you had mentioned, that's here. I just can't tell you how important this is to pass this on to people like me that can just sit down and listen to the stories. And a lot of people have those stories. And those stories are here.
Before we dismiss, I want to just say one word about the cemetery that some of you may not know, but this cemetery is built on the old pattern of Christian cemeteries. Originally, all Christian cemeteries were built so that when people were buried, their feet were placed to the east and their head was placed to the west. So when you walk out here and look at it, you're looking at the back of the cemetery. Actually, you have to walk around to see where the names are written, because that's the front. So you're looking at the headstone. And the reason they did that was for two reasons, but primarily for one reason. In Scripture, it tells us that Jesus will come back through the eastern skies. And so people were buried with their feet to the east and their head to the west, so that they would always be facing the eastern skies. One, so they could always see the sun rise, and two, so they could see the sun return. And so that's, even in the way that they were buried, was a testimony to Scripture and to the way that we think about this life and the next life.